A reconnaissance. Spitfire rolled sharply over the English Channel as the first light of morning touched the horizon. Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill peered through his cockpit glass, hunting for the Messerschmitt that had been tailing him since he entered French territory. Nothing there. The German pilot had simply lost track of him in the dim light, even though he'd been less than 1,000 yards away just moments before. Hill's Spitfire wasn't wearing the standard sky blue or camouflage green you'd see on most RAF fighters. Instead, it was pink, flamingo pink to be exact, and that strange color choice had just kept him alive. By the fall of 1940, RAF photo reconnaissance squadrons were facing a crisis that put Britain's intelligence-gathering capabilities at risk. The traditional fighter paint schemes, dark earth and green on top with sky blue underneath, worked well enough during midday missions when planes could blend against either terrain or sky, depending on where you were looking from. But reconnaissance flights operated under completely different circumstances. These unarmed Spitfires, stripped of weapons and armor to gain maximum speed and distance, flew solo deep behind enemy lines. They couldn't engage in combat. They couldn't hide within a formation. Their sole protection was avoiding detection altogether, and the conventional camouflage was getting airmen killed at a disturbing rate during the golden hours that produced the best intelligence photographs. The issue came down to timing. Reconnaissance flights needed particular lighting. Too bright, and shadows vanished, making it hard to analyze terrain. Too dark, and cameras couldn't pick up details. The ideal window came during what airmen called the magic hour, those valuable minutes at sunrise and sunset when the sun hung low, creating long shadows that revealed troop positions, artillery locations, and defensive structures. But this same lighting that made reconnaissance worthwhile also made aircraft dangerously visible. The slanted sunlight transformed standard blue-gray camouflage into a dark, easily noticed silhouette against the pink and orange horizon. Casualties increased through late 1940. Photographic reconnaissance sorties from RAF Benson and RAF Wick were coming back riddled with bullet holes. When they came back at all, the Luftwaffe had figured out the timing patterns. German fighters started waiting at high altitude during sunrise and sunset, expecting the solitary Spitfires that showed up with predictable regularity. On November 12, 1940, 3 reconnaissance planes failed to return from different missions over northern France. All 3 had been flying during twilight. The Air Ministry required a solution, and they required it fast. Britain's entire intelligence operation relied on photographic reconnaissance. Without precise images of German installations, invasion preparations, and industrial facilities, Bomber Command would be attacking blindly. The answer emerged from an unlikely source. Wing Commander Geoffrey Tuttle, who commanded the Photographic Development Unit at Heston, had been fixated on the visibility challenge for months. Tuttle was a thorough officer who'd fought in the First World War and knew that survival frequently depended on details others missed. He'd been running informal tests, holding colored samples against the sky at various times of day, recording which shades disappeared most successfully. His findings seemed ridiculous. At sunrise and sunset, pink provided the best concealment. Not a light blush pink, but a richer shade somewhere between salmon and flamingo. The atmospheric conditions during twilight bent light in unusual ways, and pink wavelengths scattered differently than blues or grays. Tuttle's hypothesis met immediate doubt. Senior officers considered the idea laughable. Pink airplanes seemed better suited for a comedy show than genuine military use. But Tuttle had photographs supporting his observations, and more importantly, he had desperate squadron leaders willing to attempt anything to stop losing men. In December 1940, he got cautious permission to run proper experiments. One Spitfire would be painted in this test pink scheme and flown during sunrise and sunset, while observers on the ground and in chase planes documented how visible it was. If the experiment worked, the paint scheme would spread across reconnaissance squadrons. If it flopped, Tuttle would probably be quietly moved to a desk position where his unusual ideas couldn't waste precious resources. The science underlying Tuttle's pink discovery relied on principles that wouldn't be completely grasped until decades afterward. Still, veteran pilots had already sensed the basic reality through countless hours watching light behavior at high altitude. When sunlight penetrates Earth's atmosphere, it doesn't just illuminate everything evenly. The atmosphere functions as an enormous optical filter, scattering various wavelengths of light with different efficiency based on the sun's angle, atmospheric thickness, and the particles floating in the air. This scattering effect, known as Rayleigh scattering, explains why the sky looks blue at midday. Shorter blue wavelengths scatter more readily than longer red wavelengths, filling the sky with diffuse blue light. But sunrise and sunset work under fundamentally different physics. When the sun sits near the horizon, its light must pass through a much thicker slice of atmosphere to reach someone watching, roughly 38 times more atmosphere than when the sun's directly overhead. This extended path filters out most blue light completely, letting longer wavelengths dominate. The sky transforms into gradients of oranges, pinks, and reds. More critically for camouflage, the ambient light washing over everything at these hours carries this same warm color tone. How visible an object is depends not just on its color, but on how that color contrasts with the background light spectrum. A sky blue aircraft that blends beautifully against midday cerulean becomes a dark, obvious blob during twilight. The blue pigment absorbs the dominant pink and orange wavelengths instead of reflecting them, creating sharp contrast. The human eye, evolved to spot contrast as a survival tool, catches this mismatch immediately. German pilots didn't need to comprehend the physics. They just saw British reconnaissance Spitfires as dark shapes against the colorful dawn sky, frequently from distances exceeding 3 miles. In air combat, seeing the enemy first gave an overwhelming tactical edge. The side that saw without being seen controlled the fight completely. Pink pigment, in contrast, reflected the dominant wavelengths present during twilight. When dawn light, rich in pink and orange tones, hit a pink-painted aircraft, the surface bounced those wavelengths back efficiently. The reflected light matched the background sky color temperature nearly perfectly. This color harmony drastically cut contrast, helping the aircraft blend into the surrounding environment. The effect wasn't perfect in visibility, but it significantly reduced detection distance. Where a blue Spitfire might be spotted at 3 miles, a pink one might stay invisible until within half a mile. In tactical language, this meant the difference between a successful reconnaissance run and an interception that ended with a pilot parachuting down over occupied France. The specific shade mattered enormously. Too pale, and the pink looked washed out, creating a light spot against the richer sky colors. Too deep, and it darkened into a silhouette. Tuttle's tests had identified a middle tone, officially labeled camouflage pink in later RAF records, though pilots universally called it Mountbatten Pink, after Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, who promoted similar schemes for naval ships. The color sat somewhere between salmon and coral, with enough richness to match the typical dawn sky over northern Europe during spring and fall months when reconnaissance operations increased. Atmospheric conditions varied, naturally. A clear sunrise produced different color temperatures than an overcast one. Winter light ran colder than summer light, but the pink scheme delivered superior performance across a wider range of twilight conditions than any other color tested. Blue-gray worked adequately during one narrow lighting band, but failed catastrophically outside that window. Pink degraded more gracefully. Even when conditions weren't optimal, it rarely created the harsh silhouette effect that made conventional camouflage so dangerous during golden hour missions. The Germans, meanwhile, remained largely unprepared for this development. Luftwaffe doctrine trained pilots to scan for dark shapes against bright backgrounds, the universal signature of enemy aircraft throughout aviation history. Their visual search techniques, refined through hundreds of training hours, focused on detecting movement and contrast. Pink Spitfires disrupted both signals simultaneously. The unusual color reduced contrast, while the lack of sharp edges in the color-matched scheme made movement harder to track peripherally. German pilots occasionally reported ghost aircraft, fleeting glimpses of something that disappeared when they tried to focus directly on it. This phenomenon resulted from the pink camouflage interacting with the eye's different sensitivity to color at the periphery versus the center of vision. RAF Benson in Oxfordshire became the testing ground where theory met reality in early January 1941. The station housed several photographic reconnaissance squadrons, and its paint workshops had already gained experience modifying standard camouflage schemes to improve survivability. Squadron leader Geoffrey de Havilland, cousin of the famous aircraft designer, oversaw the initial experiments with the systematic precision of a scientist running laboratory tests. De Havilland was no ordinary pilot. He held an engineering degree from Cambridge and had published several technical papers on aircraft visibility before the war. When Tuttle's pink proposal reached him, de Havilland immediately understood both its potential and the absolute need for rigorous testing before risking pilots' lives on an unproven idea. The first experimental aircraft, Spitfire PRIG, serial number P9551, arrived at Benson's paint shops on January 8, 1941. Ground crews removed the existing camouflage completely, sanding the aluminum skin back to bare metal to ensure the new paint would stick properly and show a uniform color. The paint itself created immediate problems. Standard RAF camouflage colors came pre-mixed in sealed containers with strictly controlled formulas. Pink existed nowhere in the official inventory. De Havilland's team had to create it from nothing, mixing red and white cellulose dope in different ratios while holding test samples against the sky at various times of day. The objective wasn't simply achieving a pleasant pink, but matching the exact hue and saturation that would provide optimal concealment during the critical dawn and dusk periods. They mixed 17 different versions before settling on a formula. Too much white created a chalky, pale pink that stood out as a light patch. Too much red pushed the color toward magenta, which created unacceptable contrast against the orange-dominated dawn sky. The winning mixture used roughly 1 part red dope to 3 parts white, with small amounts of yellow added to warm the tone slightly, applied in 3 thin layers to ensure even coverage. The outcome was a soft coral salmon that looked absolutely bizarre on the ground in broad daylight. Ground crews joked that P9551 looked dressed for a garden party rather than combat operations. But ground visibility didn't matter. Only sky visibility counted. De Havilland designed the experiments with scientific thoroughness. He established observation positions at varying distances and altitudes around Benson, staffing them with personnel equipped with binoculars and aircraft recognition training. The test protocol required P9551 to fly alongside a standard blue-gray camouflaged Spitfire during sunrise and sunset, while observers recorded visibility ranges for both aircraft. To eliminate observer prejudice, the trials used blind testing. Observers didn't know which aircraft carried which scheme until after they'd recorded their observations. Chase aircraft accompanied the test flights, providing aerial observation points at different angles and distances. Each trial lasted roughly 30 minutes, capturing the full progression of light conditions as the sun approached or left the horizon. The results exceeded even Tuttle's optimistic expectations. On the morning of January 14, 1941, during the first proper comparative trial, ground observers consistently spotted the blue-grey Spitfire at ranges between 2 and 3 miles, while the pink aircraft remained invisible until it closed to within 1 mile. The aerial observers reported even more dramatic differences. Flight Lieutenant James Riddell, flying chase in a Hurricane, later wrote in his mission report that he'd completely lost visual contact with the pink aircraft on 3 separate occasions, despite knowing its approximate location and actively searching for it. The blue-grey aircraft, by comparison, remained continuously visible throughout the sortie. Following trials, refined understanding of when and where the pink scheme offered maximum advantage. The camouflage worked best at altitudes between 15 and 25,000 feet, the typical operating height for reconnaissance missions. Below 10,000 feet, the pink aircraft became more visible as observers looked upward against a darker blue sky rather than horizontally against a lighter horizon. The scheme performed exceptionally well in the slanted lighting of early morning and late evening as expected, but also showed surprising effectiveness during overcast conditions, when diffuse grey cloud cover took on subtle warm tones. De Havilland documented one unexpected benefit during the January 21st trials. When both test aircraft flew directly toward the sun, the pink Spitfire became nearly impossible to distinguish from the solar glare surrounding it, while the blue-grey aircraft remained visible as a dark spot. This proved particularly valuable for reconnaissance pilots making their escape after completing photography runs, as they often used a sun-facing trajectory to complicate pursuit. The pink fuselage scattered the intense, backlit sunlight in ways that matched the atmospheric glow, essentially camouflaging the aircraft within the sun's own halo. The operational deployment of Mountbatten Pink began quietly in March 1941 with 3 modified Spitfire PRIGs assigned to reconnaissance missions over the French coast. The pilots selected for these first sorties were experienced hands who'd already completed dozens of missions in conventional camouflage and could provide reliable comparisons. Flight Lieutenant Alistair Taylor flew the first operational Pink sortie on March 17th, tasked with photographing German shipping movements in Brest Harbor. Taylor later described the mission as unnervingly peaceful. He'd grown accustomed to constant vigilance during dawn runs, knowing enemy fighters hunted aggressively during these hours. But the entire sortie passed without a single interception attempt, despite Luftwaffe presence being confirmed by radio intercepts. Taylor completed his photography run, turned for home, and landed at Benson 90 minutes later with a pristine, bullet-free aircraft. The second mission told a more dramatic story. On March 23rd, pilot officer Adrian Warburton, already legendary within reconnaissance circles for his aggressive flying style, took a pink Spitfire deep into occupied Belgium to photograph railway marshalling yards near Liège. Unlike Taylor's uneventful sortie, Warburton encountered a pair of Messerschmitt Bf 109s patrolling at 22,000 feet just after dawn. The German fighters passed within 800 yards, close enough that Warburton could see the lead pilot's head moving as he scanned the sky, but they never looked directly at him. The Messerschmitts continued their patrol pattern, apparently oblivious to the British aircraft operating almost within gun range. Warburton completed his photography, descended to lower altitude, where the pink scheme became less effective, and used his Spitfire's superior speed to outrun a belated interception attempt once the Germans finally spotted him over the coast. These early successes generated immediate demand for more pink aircraft. By May 1941, RAF Benson's paint shops were working around the clock to convert reconnaissance Spitfires to the new scheme. The program expanded to include the longer-range PR4 variant, which carried additional fuel tanks for deep penetration missions into Germany itself. Pilots traded stories about their pink Spitfires with a mixture of affection and disbelief that typically accompanied effective but unconventional equipment. Squadron leader Hugh Pugh Lloyd, commanding No. 1 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, wrote in his logbook that flying a pink aircraft made him feel rather like a ballet dancer going to war, but he acknowledged the scheme had reduced losses by roughly 60% compared to the previous quarter. Not every mission succeeded, of course. The pink camouflage reduced detection range, but couldn't eliminate it entirely. Sharp-eyed German pilots occasionally spotted the pink Spitfires, particularly during midday hours when the scheme offered little advantage. On June 8, 1941, pilot officer Michael Constable Maxwell took cannon damage from a Bf-109 over Wilhelmshaven, despite flying a pink aircraft. The German pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, later recounted in debriefing that he'd spotted something unusual about the British aircraft's color, but had been too focused on the difficult deflection shot to analyze it properly. Maxwell nursed his damaged Spitfire back across the North Sea, crash landing at RAF Colterschall with his precious reconnaissance photographs intact. The Mediterranean theater adopted pink camouflage with particular enthusiasm. The light conditions over North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean produced even more dramatic twilight colors than Northern Europe, making the pink scheme exceptionally effective. Spitfires operating from Malta in late 1941 began receiving pink paint jobs specifically for dawn reconnaissance missions over Sicily and southern Italy. Flight Lieutenant Frank Lister, flying from Malta's battered Lucca airfield, completed 23 consecutive dawn missions in his pink PR-4 without encountering a single interception during the critical photography phase. Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica fighters stationed in Sicily complained about British reconnaissance aircraft that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, never remaining visible long enough to establish pursuit. The psychological impact on pilots proved as valuable as the tactical advantage. Reconnaissance flying was lonely, dangerous work that depended entirely on stealth and speed rather than offensive capability. Pilots flew unarmed and alone, knowing that any encounter with enemy fighters would likely prove fatal. The pink camouflage restored a measure of confidence that standard schemes had eroded. Men volunteered for reconnaissance duty who'd previously avoided it, drawn by the improved survival odds. The peculiar pride pilots took in their pink Spitfires became evident in the nose art and unofficial markings that began appearing. Small flamingos, pink panthers, and cheeky references to the unconventional color scheme. One aircraft at Benson carried the legend, "Pretty in pink," beneath the cockpit, a joke that captured both the absurdity and the deadly effectiveness of Mountbatten Pink. German intelligence officers first began documenting unusual sighting reports in April 1941, though they initially dismissed the accounts as observer error or atmospheric phenomena. Luftwaffe pilots returning from Channel patrol missions described British aircraft that seemed to shimmer or fade from view at certain angles, particularly during dawn and dusk engagements. Debriefing officers attributed these reports to fatigue, the notorious unreliability of visual identification at extreme ranges, or the well-known optical illusions that plagued high-altitude flying. But as reports accumulated through spring and early summer, patterns emerged that demanded serious investigation. Multiple experienced pilots, including several aces with dozens of confirmed kills, independently described similar observations. British reconnaissance aircraft that appeared briefly then vanished, despite clear visibility and adequate pursuit positioning. The breakthrough came in mid-June 1941, when Oberleutnant Wilhelm Balthasar, a highly decorated fighter pilot with 40 victories, managed to close within 300 yards of a reconnaissance Spitfire before it accelerated away. Balthasar's combat report noted something extraordinary. The British aircraft appeared to be painted in a reddish or pinkish color, rather than the standard blue-gray scheme. His ground crew initially laughed at the description, assuming the famous ace had finally cracked under operational stress. But Balthazar insisted on the accuracy of his observation, sketching the aircraft's appearance in his mission log and demanding the report be forwarded to Fighter Command headquarters. When Luftwaffe intelligence cross-referenced his account with other recent sightings, they found 6 separate reports mentioning unusual coloration on British reconnaissance aircraft, all dated between March and June 1941. German technical intelligence scrambled to understand the innovation. Without captured examples or clear photographs, they were forced to theorize about both the color and its purpose. Some analysts suggested the British were using temporary paint schemes that washed off after missions, explaining why shot-down Spitfires consistently showed standard camouflage. Others proposed that atmospheric conditions over Britain created optical effects that made blue-gray aircraft appear pink under certain lighting, a theory that gained traction until pilots familiar with dawn and dusk operations pointed out they'd never observed such effects on German aircraft. The correct explanation, that the British had deliberately developed twilight-specific camouflage, seemed too innovative to credit initially. German doctrine considered camouflage a relatively static science with well-established principles. The notion that an enemy might create specialized color schemes for specific times of day struck many officers as unnecessarily complicated. By August 1941, Luftwaffe fighter units received tactical bulletins acknowledging the pink Spitfire phenomenon and offering guidance for countering it. The directives advised pilots to increase visual scanning intensity during dawn and dusk hours, to watch for subtle movement rather than relying on color contrast, and to position patrol patterns closer to known reconnaissance routes to reduce detection ranges. Some units experimented with positioning fighters at different altitudes, reasoning that pink camouflage optimized for horizontal viewing might remain visible to aircraft looking down from above. This tactic showed modest success. German pilots reported improved detection rates when patrolling at 28 to 30,000 feet, well above the typical reconnaissance operating altitude. The Germans also attempted to develop countermeasures. In September 1941, several Bf 109 units received experimental paint schemes featuring lighter colors intended to improve concealment during dawn patrols. These trials proved frustrating. The Messerschmitts operated primarily as interceptors rather than reconnaissance aircraft, which meant they needed camouflage effective across all lighting conditions, not just twilight hours. Pink schemes that worked brilliantly for British reconnaissance aircraft made German fighters conspicuous during midday combat when most engagements occurred. The Luftwaffe eventually settled on slightly lighter variations of their standard grey-green schemes, accepting reduced effectiveness during dawn and dusk as an unavoidable compromise. Propaganda considerations complicated the German response. Luftwaffe High Command recognized that acknowledging British technological and tactical innovation would undermine public confidence in German air superiority. Official communiques continued to emphasize German fighter dominance while carefully avoiding any mention of camouflage developments that might suggest British cleverness. The pink Spitfires became an open secret within fighter units, but remained largely unknown to the German public and even to many Luftwaffe support personnel. This information compartmentalization prevented the Germans from fully mobilizing their technical resources to counter the threat. Scientists and engineers who might have offered solutions remained unaware of the problem. Radio intelligence provided the British with regular updates on German reactions. Decoded Enigma traffic revealed Luftwaffe frustration with elusive reconnaissance aircraft and confirmed that German pilots were indeed struggling with detection during critical hours. These intercepts validated the pink scheme's effectiveness, while simultaneously warning that the Germans were adapting their tactics. The game of concealment and detection had entered a new phase. with both sides now aware they were engaged in a specialized camouflage competition that would continue evolving throughout the conflict. The chemists and paint technicians at RAF maintenance units faced challenges that went far beyond simply mixing the correct shade of pink. Aircraft paint in 1941 relied on cellulose dope, a nitrocellulose-based coating originally developed to tighten and protect the fabric covering on early airplanes. Although the Spitfire's stressed aluminum skin didn't require dope for structural reasons, cellulose formulations remained standard because they dried quickly, adhered well to metal, and could be applied with relatively unsophisticated equipment available at forward airfields. But cellulose dope brought significant disadvantages that became painfully apparent with the pink camouflage program. The primary problem was color stability. Standard RAF camouflage colors, dark earth, dark green, ocean gray, used pigments that resisted fading reasonably well under prolonged ultraviolet exposure. Pink pigments proved far more fugitive. The iron oxide reds and titanium white used to create Mountbatten Pink degraded rapidly when exposed to sunlight at altitude, where UV intensity exceeded ground-level exposure by substantial margins. Within 3 weeks of operational flying, pink Spitfires often faded to a washed-out coral that no longer matched the optimal concealment shade. Aircraft that had been carefully painted to precise color specifications returned from a dozen missions looking like they'd spent months in the desert sun. Sergeant Albert Hoskins, a paint supervisor at RAF Benson, recalled the frustration of maintaining color consistency across the reconnaissance fleet. His workshop logged painting hours meticulously, and the records show that pink aircraft required complete repainting every 40 to 50 flying hours, compared to 150 to 200 hours for standard camouflage schemes. The labor investment was substantial. Each complete repaint required 3 days of work, including surface preparation, multiple coat application, and drying time. With reconnaissance squadrons operating at high tempo during 1941 and 1942, Benson's paint shops struggled to keep aircraft in service while maintaining the color precision that made the camouflage effective. Environmental conditions accelerated degradation. Aircraft operating from Mediterranean bases, where intense sunlight and high temperatures prevailed, suffered particularly rapid fading. Malta-based pink Spitfires sometimes required repainting after just 20 flying hours. Ground crews experimented with various solutions, applying extra clear protective coats over the pink, mixing UV-inhibiting compounds into the paint, even attempting to park aircraft in shade between missions. Nothing substantially improved color stability without compromising other essential properties. Heavier protective coatings added weight and reduced the reconnaissance Spitfire's crucial speed advantage. UV inhibitors available in 1941 proved either ineffective or chemically incompatible with cellulose dope formulations. The paint itself posed handling difficulties. Creating consistent pink batches required precise measurement and mixing, but field conditions rarely permitted laboratory accuracy. Paint technicians mixed colors by eye, comparing test cards against previous batches and making adjustments based on experience rather than scientific measurement. Different mixing personnel produced slightly different shades, creating a fleet of pink Spitfires that ranged from pale salmon to deep coral. Some variation was acceptable. No two dawns produced identical light conditions anyway. But excessive variation meant some aircraft received suboptimal camouflage, while others carried nearly ideal schemes purely by chance. Supply chain complications emerged as the program expanded. Standard camouflage colors arrived premixed from centralized factories where quality control ensured consistency. Pink camouflage, being non-standard, required local units to maintain stocks of red and white dope and perform their own mixing. This decentralization introduced quality variations and created logistical headaches, Red and white pigments had different supply priorities in the military procurement system. White dope occasionally ran short because it was also used in high volumes for aircraft identification markings and interior cockpit painting. When white supplies dwindled, maintenance units had to choose between halting pink aircraft repaints or mixing deeper, redder pinks that performed less optimally. Maintenance crews also discovered that pink dope showed damage more obviously than darker camouflage colors. Bullet holes, panel repairs, and even minor scratches stood out starkly against the light background, requiring more extensive touch-up work to maintain the aircraft's visual profile. Patched sections rarely matched the surrounding faded color perfectly unless the entire aircraft received fresh paint. Corporal James Whitfield, an airframe fitter at Benson, noted in his diary that pink Spitfires looked constantly scruffy compared to their dark camouflaged counterparts. Even though the reconnaissance aircraft generally suffered less combat damage than fighter variants, the visual evidence of wear and repair bothered pilots psychologically, making their aircraft appear less airworthy, even when structural integrity remained sound. The operational landscape that had birthed pink Spitfires began shifting fundamentally in late 1942 as Allied strategic priorities evolved. The reconnaissance missions that thrived on dawn and dusk concealment found themselves increasingly overshadowed by a different aerial imperative: daylight bomber operations deep into German territory. The United States Army Air Forces had arrived in Britain in substantial numbers, bringing with them an unwavering doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing conducted in broad daylight. This strategic shift, combined with technological developments that changed how reconnaissance itself was conducted, steadily eroded the tactical niche that made pink camouflage valuable. The American bomber offensive demanded fighter escorts capable of accompanying B-17 and B-24 formations all the way to targets in Germany and back. Range, not concealment, became the paramount requirement. Spitfires, even long-range variants, lacked the fuel capacity for deep penetration escort missions. The North American P-51 Mustang, arriving in substantial numbers from mid-1943, offered the range necessary to protect bombers over Berlin. But escort fighters needed to be seen by the bombers they protected. Formation flying at 30,000 feet in potentially hostile airspace required visual contact with friendly aircraft. Pink camouflage that helped a lone Spitfire hide from enemies also made it difficult for Allied bombers to locate their escorts in the vast sky. Reconnaissance priorities shifted accordingly. While dawn and dusk photography remained valuable, the explosive growth of daylight bombing operations created urgent demand for bomb damage assessment photography conducted at midday, when shadows revealed structural destruction most clearly. Targets hit by night raids needed to be photographed the following afternoon to assess whether follow-up missions were necessary. This midday reconnaissance occurred under lighting conditions where pink camouflage offered no advantage and sometimes proved actively detrimental, making aircraft more visible than conventional schemes. By January 1943, more than half of RAF reconnaissance sorties were flying in the middle of the day rather than during twilight hours. Technology also intervened. The introduction of the Spitfire PR-10, variant in late 1942, brought significant improvements in speed and altitude performance. These aircraft routinely operated above 40,000 feet, where extreme altitude provided protection superior to any camouflage scheme. At these heights, the aircraft's small size and the vast volume of sky made visual detection unlikely regardless of color. Pilots flying PR-10 Spitfires reported that German fighters rarely attempted interception above 38,000 feet. The performance envelope of the Bf-109 and FW-190 made high-altitude combat impractical. When protection came from altitude rather than concealment, the labor-intensive pink paint program lost its justification. The Mediterranean campaigns of 1943 further diminished pink camouflage utility. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July, required massive photographic reconnaissance to map beaches, identify defensive positions, and track German reinforcements. But these missions flew in formation, often with fighter escort, during daylight hours when operational tempo could be maximized. The careful solitary dawn reconnaissance missions that had characterized 1941 and 1942 gave way to systematic photography programs that prioritized comprehensive coverage over stealth. Aircraft flew in pairs or even larger groups, accepting the increased visibility in exchange for mutual defense and the ability to rephotograph areas if one aircraft's cameras malfunctioned. Maintenance burden provided another compelling reason to phase out pink schemes. As documented earlier, the color's rapid fading required constant repainting that consumed resources increasingly needed elsewhere. By mid-1943, RAF maintenance units were supporting the largest aerial offensive in history while simultaneously preparing for the eventual invasion of France. Every man-hour spent mixing pink paint and repainting reconnaissance Spitfires was a man-hour not spent on more pressing maintenance tasks. Wing Commander David Atcherley, reviewing maintenance efficiency at multiple reconnaissance units in August 1943, recommended discontinuing pink camouflage on purely logistical grounds. The scheme's diminishing tactical value no longer justified its disproportionate maintenance requirements. The final pink reconnaissance missions flew in autumn 1943, though exact dates remain unclear because the transition happened gradually rather than through a single directive. Aircraft came in for scheduled maintenance in pink and left the paint shops in ocean grey or PRU blue, a darker, more stable blue-grey scheme that had replaced the earlier sky blue on many reconnaissance variants. Pilots noticed the change without much comment. The pink Spitfires had served their purpose during a critical period when Britain fought largely alone, and every tactical advantage mattered desperately. But warfare had evolved beyond the peculiar niche those flamingo-colored aircraft had filled so effectively. The pink Spitfires disappeared from operational service, but the principles they validated continued shaping military camouflage thinking for decades. The fundamental insight that effective concealment requires matching not just the background, but the specific lighting conditions under which observation occurs, became foundational to modern stealth doctrine. When American engineers began designing the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter in the late 1970s, they faced a conceptually similar problem to the one RAF reconnaissance pilots had confronted 40 years earlier. The F-117 would operate at night, attacking targets when darkness provided natural concealment. What color should it be? The obvious answer was black, and indeed, early concept drawings showed F-117s in glossy black schemes. But the Lockheed Skunk Works team, led by designers who'd studied historical camouflage effectiveness, recognized that pure black created problems. At altitude, even on moonless nights, aircraft appeared silhouetted against a sky that was never truly black, but rather a deep blue-gray, lit by starlight, air glow, and diffuse light from ground sources. Black aircraft stood out as darker voids against this ambient illumination. The solution, informed partly by RAF Pink Spitfire documentation that had been declassified and studied by American military researchers, involved a dark gray scheme carefully calibrated to match the night sky's actual luminance. The F-117's final paint color, officially designated have-glass dark gray, bore the intellectual fingerprints of Mountbatten Pink, adapted for nocturnal rather than twilight operations. Modern adaptive camouflage research pursues the pink Spitfire concept to its logical extreme. Military laboratories in Britain, the United States, and Sweden have developed experimental systems using electroluminescent panels or advanced display technology mounted on vehicle and aircraft surfaces. These systems employ cameras to sample the surrounding environment, then display the appropriate color and brightness on the opposite surface, essentially rendering the vehicle invisible from specific viewing angles. The BAE systems. Adaptive system, demonstrated on armored vehicles in 2011, can change its thermal and visual signature in seconds, matching backgrounds ranging from desert sand to forest vegetation. The conceptual lineage traces directly back to the insight that camouflage effectiveness depends on dynamic matching between object and environment, rather than static color choice. Naval applications proved particularly receptive to the pink Spitfire lessons. Lord Mountbatten, whose name became synonymous with pink camouflage despite his involvement being largely coincidental, actually championed similar schemes for Royal Navy vessels operating in specific lighting conditions. Destroyers painted in pale grey-pink hues during 1942 trials showed reduced visibility during dawn and dusk periods when submarines surfaced to charge batteries and attack convoys. The principle worked identically to aerial camouflage, matching the vessel's color to the dominant wavelengths present during twilight hours rather than optimizing for midday visibility. Though naval pink schemes faced the same maintenance challenges as aircraft paint and were eventually abandoned, modern warship designers continue using light gray colors carefully calibrated for the maritime environment's typical lighting conditions. The broader legacy extends to understanding perception itself. Military psychologists studying the pink Spitfire phenomenon contributed to research on human visual detection mechanisms, particularly how the eye distinguishes objects from backgrounds under varying illumination. This research influenced everything from pilot training programs to the design of aircraft recognition systems. The recognition that contrast detection mattered more than absolute color led to training methods that emphasized pattern recognition and movement detection rather than memorizing specific color schemes. Modern air forces train pilots to spot anomalies in the visual field, disruptions of expected patterns, rather than looking for aircraft of particular colors. Commercial aviation borrowed concepts from military camouflage research, though for different purposes. Airlines discovered that aircraft painted in lighter colors experienced less thermal stress from solar heating, reducing metal fatigue and extending airframe life. The preference for white or very light gray on commercial aircraft stems partly from thermal considerations, but also from visibility. Airliners need to be seen by other traffic for collision avoidance, the opposite priority from military reconnaissance. Yet the research that determined optimal light colors for commercial aviation drew on databases originally compiled during wartime camouflage studies, including extensive data from the pink Spitfire trials. The cultural legacy persists in aviation communities, where the pink Spitfire story remains beloved for its combination of absurdity and effectiveness. Air shows occasionally feature Spitfires painted in Mountbatten Pink, delighting crowds who expect the graceful fighters in traditional colors. Aviation museums debate the historical accuracy of pink schemes when restoring period aircraft. Documentation about which specific aircraft received pink paint and when remains incomplete. The RAF Museum at Hendon maintains a Spitfire PRIG painted in authentic Mountbatten Pink, one of the few preserved examples of this unusual camouflage. Visitors invariably stop and stare, drawn by a color that seems fundamentally wrong on a warplane, yet represents genuine innovation born from operational necessity. Those flamingo-colored fighters, ridiculous as they appeared on the ground, proved that warfare sometimes rewards the unconventional thinker, willing to challenge assumptions about how things should look. The invisible pink Spitfires that haunted German-occupied skies during dawn hours in 1941 taught lessons that continue resonating wherever concealment matters and light behaves in predictable but unexpected ways.